Welcome to video 16 of Gamer to Game Developer Series 1, and this video is about player resource. So we have 5 objectives. The first is that we'll discuss the player resource script, then we'll make the resource bar texture, and then we'll update 3 scripts. We'll update the stat display script so that it now shows resource and the resource bar. We'll update the player asks server to place construction block script so that when the player places a construction block, a little bit of resource gets consumed, and the same for the fire block eraser script. So when the player uses their block eraser, then a little bit of resource once again will get used. So it really is very simple how it works. What we have here is our HUD that you already know. It's displaying health, energy, and now we'll display resource. And this is controlled by the stat display script. And all it's doing is it's looking at these 3 scripts, player resource, energy, and health and damage. It looks at them, it accesses them constantly, and checks the current figure for, in our current case, resource, so the player's resource. So it'll look at what the player resource is, and then just display that. Now, resource can decrease by, well, when it's used. So when the player places a construction block, then this script, the player asks server to place construction block script, will access the player resource script and deduct some resource. And same thing, when the player uses the block eraser, some resource will get deducted. So very simple. So we'll move on to our first step, which is to discuss the player resource script, and I'll go through and explain how it works. Alright, I'll go over the player resource script, which you'll have downloaded and placed into your scripts package, well, folder, and I'll just open it up. Okay, and I'll expand the summary. Oh, and as you can see, it's really short and simple. It's like the player energy script. So in the summary, what we have here is that this script is attached to the player and it governs their resource. This script is accessed by the stat display script, which checks the player's current resource, as we had just discussed just moments ago in the introduction. And this script is accessed by the player asks server to place construction block, or even the air block later on, script to reduce the player's resource when they place a block. And then this script is accessed by the fire block eraser script to reduce the player's resource when they remove a block. Okay, so our variables now, just 4 of them. So the first one is a float resource. This is the current player's current resource. This is the main variable here. Then we have a float base resource, which we set to 100. Later on, it won't be 100. We'll have stats, the ability for the player to choose their stats. So the player can have more than 100 resource or whatever figure. And later on, we'll see how that changes. It's very simple as well. It'll just access the relevant script and base resource will equal that figure. But for now, base resource is equal to 100. Then we have float base recharge rate, and that's 7. So the rate at which our resource should regenerate. So the bigger the number, then obviously the faster player resource is going to regenerate over time. And I have here another one, float regenerator modifier. Truth is, I don't use it in series 1 at all. It's 0, but later on when you see the video where I show you how to make resource pickups and energy pickup and health pickup, you can use the exact same thing, same system to make up, for example, a power-up, and that you could use you could then set the regenerator modifier to another number, and you'll see down below what the effect of that will be. It'll just simply increase the rate of the resource recharging. Okay, so now in the start function, all we have is that if this script is not on our player in our game instance, then it's disabled, but otherwise resource is equal to the base resource. So in this case, it'll be 100 when the player spawns into the game for the first time. And every subsequent time that they spawn into the game, they'll have a resource level of 100, which is the base resource. Then we have a look at our update function, and very simply, if the player's current resource level, is less than their base resource, so the player's used up some resource, they're at maybe 70 now, they're less than 100, so now we recharge the resource. So resource is equal to resource plus the base recharge rate plus that regenerator modifier times time.delta time. So it's smoothing out for different frame rates here, as you already know. So as you can see, by adding the regenerator modifier to the base recharge rate, we're just simply increasing the recharge rate. Very, very, very simple. Okay. Then we prevent the player's resource from exceeding the base resource or falling below 0. So if the resource is ever greater than the base resource, which can happen when you pick up with the player is at, say, at 80 resource and they walk over a resource pickup that'll recharge them by 100, then what'll happen obviously is then they'd have 180. So we just simply we just simply knock back the player's resource back to their base resource, which is what you see here. So if the resource is greater than their base resource, then the resource is simply set to be equal to the base resource. Then for the case where resource is less than 0, if somehow that were to happen, it shouldn't happen, but in case if it ever did, for some reason, then just simply set resource to 0, a clean 0, and there won't be any problem with how it's displayed in the stat display. Okay, so that is actually it. So as you saw, the player resource script is really simple. So now we'll go on to the next step where we just need to make the texture, and after that, we'll start updating the scripts. Our next step is to make the resource bar texture. Alright, let's make a new texture. So file new, and the size will be 128 by 16. Okay, and then we'll add an alpha channel. So we just go to layers, layer, transparency, add alpha channel. Then we'll clear the background. So edit, clear, and then we'll give a different forecolor. We'll change the forecolor to a nice magenta color. So I know the figures already, so I'll just simply set them. I'll just type them in. So it's red is 215, green is 100, and blue is 255. Okay. So I'll just hit OK. And now I'll change the background color. So for this, I'll set red to 200. I'll set green to 20. So it's a darker shade. And blue, I'll leave it at 255 and say OK. Now I'll select the gradient tool and I'll set the opacity to 80%. All right. And then I'll simply apply it. So I just drag from left to right. And that's it. That's our resource bar texture. And it's got a little bit of transparency to it. And now I'll go ahead and save it. So save as in our folder, assets, textures, and I'll call this one resource bar .png and just save it. All right, save. Okay, so that should be it. I'll go to Unity and let's have a look at our result. And yes, it is there. And of course we can see our older bars, which are just the same sort of thing. Okay, so that's good. And that does it for this step. So we'll move on to the next step, which is about updating our scripts. We're on to step 3, and we'll now update the stat display script so that it shows the player's resource. Let's open up the stat display script and start making changes to it. Okay, so I'll start with the summary that the script is now accessing the player resource script. So this script accesses the player resource script. Okay, and I'll add some new variables as well. So over here where we have the energy bars attached, so underneath this, we'll add the same thing, that the resource bar texture is attached to this in the inspector, and that is public texture resource text. Okay. Then we'll go ahead and put in some new variables for displaying resource. So down here, I'll type used in displaying resource, and they are private float resource, private int resource for display. So if you recall, just like before for the health and energy, we have a float resource and an int. So for displaying, not displayers, for display. And the int is so that we have a whole number, just a figure that appears on the HUD that doesn't have a decimal point on it. That's why we're taking an int. Where we're defining the stat display box. Now we'll add some variables for the resource bar as well. So we have here health bar length, health bar height. So we need the same thing for the resource bar. So private float resource bar length and private int resource bar height is equal to 15. And truth is, we could use the same height for each of the bars. We could actually just make one variable called bar height and just use that in the displaying below in the onGUI function. But if you have bars of different heights, then this would be the way to go. You could then give different heights to each bar. Okay, then of course we need a new GUI style. So private GUI style resource style is equal to a new GUI style. And then finally, we'll have a quick reference to the player resource script. So we'll just simply write here, private player resource. That's the script that we'll have to access. And resource script. I'll just call this variable. Okay, so that's our variables. Now we'll go over to the start function where we'll access the player resource script. So let's go over to here. We have here access the health and damage and player energy script. So I'll just update this comment here. Access the health and damage, player energy, and player resource scripts. Okay, and then just down below here, so resource script is equal to GameObject.getComponent, and the component of course is player resource. Okay, now then we just define the resource style where we're setting the GUI styles. So we'll have here, I'll just break this up a little bit, put a space there, and here, resource style dot normal dot text color is equal to color dot magenta, and then resource style dot font style is equal to font style dot bold. Alright, so all we've done so far is to just access the resource script. We'll get a reference to it, and then we just set the GUI style for resource style. So now we actually need to go to the update function and get that resource value, calculate the resource bar length, and then also have the figure for displaying as a value without any decimals. So it's just like these bits of code here for the energy script, for the energy and health. We're going to do exactly the same thing for resource. So in fact, I'll just copy everything here for player energy. I've just copied that. And I'll paste it down here below. And now I'll start just changing names of things. So instead of player energy, player resource, access the player resource script continuously and retrieve the player's current resource. So then we have here resource is equal to, and I'll just delete that, resource script dot resource. Okay. Then here, round the resource value so there aren't any decimals. And this is the one that gets displayed as a number. So resource for display is equal to mathf.ceil2int resource. And then, and as you remember, that's it rounding it up so that we have an int from our float. And then we calculate how long the resource bar should be. So calculate how long the resource bar should be. So resource bar length is equal to resource over, and I'll get rid of this, change it to the resource script dot base resource. And as you can see here, it's just a percentage. That's what resource bar length is. It's a percentage. So that does it for the update function. Now we have to go over to the onGUI function. And this is that, you could say, messy sort of looking code where we're placing a gray box behind each of the bars. So we place a empty gray box behind the bar. Then we draw that energy bar or health bar over that gray box. And then we have a label to the right of the bar that displays the number for that stat. And the reason for the gray box is just so that it's easy to see when the energy or health or resource is less than its maximum. It's a reference. You can easily then see. Alright, so we have to do exactly the same thing, except that we're pushing the resource bar a step below the energy bar. So that's what we have to change in this code here. We can copy paste this, change all the energy references to resource, and change that spacing that'll affect the top. So the left values will be all the same. We want the left to stay all in line, but the top value, that needs to change to push the bar and the label down below. So I'll copy paste this, bring it down. So now let's draw a gray box behind the resource bar. And what do we have here? A GUI.box will have common left plus padding. Yes, that stays exactly the same. Then we have common top plus, now it's a resource bar height. So resource bar height, but it doesn't just stop there. It's resource bar height times 2. So times 2, that makes it 30. So it's 30 pixels now, plus padding times 3. So now we have 3 gaps. So let's have a look at what the value for padding was. Padding is 10. So padding is equal to 30, and we have here 15 times 2, 30, so 60. So the top of this bar will be 60 below probably the health bar, or something like that anyway. Anyway, so all you can see here is that we're just changing the top value to push this bar down, and the way I'm doing it with this resource bar height, it could have just been bar height times the value. It is positioning it at an equal spacing below the energy bar, so that all the bars look like they've got some sort of format to them. All right, so let me just check that. So GUI.box, new rect, common left plus padding, yes, common top plus resource bar height times 2 plus padding times 3. Oh, and common top, as you can see here, is calculated here. Common left is equal to screen.width divided by 2 plus 180, and common top, that's how it gets positioned at that place in the screen. And the reason why we keep calculating it in on GUI is in case if it's in web player, if the player is playing in a web player and they change to full screen, or they change back from full screen, then that's immediately, the effect of that is the player doesn't see any glitching or anything. It just immediately moves over to the correct position on the screen. Later on, I'll just mention, it's very simple how you can have a web player that can play at full screen. I haven't covered that yet. I'll do that later on in this series. It's very simple what you need to do. Okay, but anyway, so coming back down here to our GUI.box, as I was saying, I was having a look at that. Padding times 300, and yes, it should be resource bar height here. Okay, and that's it. Next, we're drawing the resource bar. So draw the resource bar and make its length be dependent on the player's current resource. GUI.drawTexture, new rect. So this bit is the bit of code that actually draws that bar. So GUI.drawTexture, new rect, common left plus padding, yes, common top plus resource bar height times 2 plus padding times 3. Yep, that looks right. And then resource bar length and resource bar height. All right, and as you recall, this bar length bit is what allows that texture to have a variable length when it's drawn, and that's why it looks like the bar is becoming shorter or longer when the player's resource is getting used or recharging. And the texture is resource text. Okay. Then for the label, same sort of thing for the spacing. So common top plus resource bar height times 2 plus padding times 3 and label width, label height, and we'll change this to resource for display. So resource for display dot toString, and the style is resource style. All right, and that is it actually for our script. So I'll just save that, have a quick look through. I'll jump over to Unity, check that there are no obvious errors. Doesn't look like anything's appearing, which is good. And that's it. So we'll leave the script alone now. We'll need to update the other 2 scripts, then we'll assemble everything together and see how it all works. And if there are no mistakes in the script, then everything should be all right. Okay, so let's move on to the next step, where we're going to update that player ask server to place that block script. We're on to our 4th step, which is to update the player ask server to place construction block script. So let's open it up. So the player asks server to place construction block script, and let's edit it. So in the summary, the first thing I'll type here is that this script accesses the player resource script. So this script accesses the player resource script. And then I'll continue onwards. And within our variables, I will put at the end, let's see here. So after the temp block, so I'll put here resource consumed when placing a construction block. So resource consumed when placing a construction block. And that is public float cost is equal to 5 and private. So this is a reference, I guess. I can add this one actually rather than down here. I can just add it up here. So cached items, private player resource is, and the variable is resource script. Okay. Now we can go over to the start function. And we'll just access that. So just below here, I'll just simply have resource script is equal to game object dot get component and that component, of course, player resource. All right, so now we have a quick reference to resource script, and now we just need to check. So what we're going to do here in our update function, where we want to be able to place a block before being able to execute the rest of the code, we'll have a simple check to just see whether the player has enough resource in the first place. So as you can see, the cost of placing a construction block is 5 resource. So we'll simply say here in this if screen.lock cursor is true and input.get button down, yes, that all remains, of course. And we'll add a new bit, and resource script dot resource is greater than or equal to cost. Okay, so that's the new bit. So now if the player does not have sufficient resource, so if their current resource level is less than 5, then they won't be able to place a block at all. So the rest of the script won't run when they try to click when they right click to place a block. The rest of it won't run because this condition isn't met. So very simple. Okay, now we need to deduct the resource when the player does place a block. So in the case when they do place a block, so we go down here to where we have this drop temp block position, etc. So we just add some new code here because this is the point where we're actually placing the block. As you can see here, there's that RPC that causes the block to get instantiated across the network. It's sent to the server, etc. And a temp block is dropped down. So now is the right time to deduct the resource. So deduct the cost of this block from the player resource script. Okay, and that is simply resource script dot resource is equal to resource script dot resource minus cost, and that's it. Okay, and now we can do something more as well. We will copy this because we need it for when we add a block to the foundation layer as well. So this bit was, as you recall, this bit of code here is all about adding a block adjacent to an existing block. So now what about when we add a block to the foundation layer? Well, we should deduct resource as well. So down here in its block of code, you'll see here that that also has that bit drop temp block, etc. So we'll just paste that in here as well. And that is pretty much it. And I'll save that. And I'll just check in Unity quickly that there's no errors appearing. No, there aren't. Okay, so that's it for this script and this step. So we'll move on to the next step. We're on to our last step, which is to update the fire block eraser script. And once we've done that, we'll assemble everything in Unity and build and run the game. Let's open up the fire block eraser script. And coming down to its summary, I will edit that. So now we'll have that this script accesses the player resource script. So this script accesses the player resource script. Okay, and then in the variables area, we'll add some new variables. So I'll write here, for deducting resource. And they are private player resource script. So a quick reference we'll establish. Let me just check, are there any up here? No, I'll keep it separate this time. So I'll keep it down here for deducting resource, and I'll put private float cost is equal to 3. Now let's go over to our start function and just establish that reference. So resource script is equal to my transform.getComponent. And of course, as you've seen many times, player resource. Okay, and now very simply, we just jump over to the update function. So when the player is clicking to remove a block, to get rid of a block, to erase it, then we should have a check that they have enough resource to do so. So let's scroll down to the bit where the player actually clicks their left mouse button. So here we go, input.getButton, fire weapon, yes, time.time greater than next fire, and now, and resource script dot resource is greater than or equal to the cost of firing the block eraser. And then next here, right after we set next fire, we'll now set the player's resource. We'll deduct their resource. So resource script dot resource is equal to resource script dot resource minus cost. And that's it. Okay, and that's it. So we've finished editing our scripts now. So now we should jump over to Unity and start putting everything together. So let's do that. So let's go over to our players. So first of all, player blue. Let's have a look. So you can see how the player energy script was. And you can see in our stat display script, there's a slot for the resource texture now open. So let's fill that. Let's go ahead, get the right texture. It's the resource bar texture. Probably would be simpler to just drag it in from the folders itself, since there's so much in there now. And I'll add the script, so component, scripts, player resource. Okay. Let's go down, check everything. Yes, and that should be just fine. That's good. Now I'll do the same for the red player. I'll jump over to the red player, give them that resource bar texture. I'll drag it in, drop it there. Okay. And I'll add that new script, the player resource script. Okay. And that has been added now. And I believe that should be everything. So we updated the fire block eraser weapon. Well, the fire block eraser script, which is within our player. So if you go to the block eraser prefab the child object inside, for example, the red player. That script is there. We updated the player asks server, player asks server to place construction block script. So there's nothing else to add there. We updated the stat display. Okay, so let's build and run. I'll set up a server with this one, and I'll join as a player here. Just in case there are any errors, I'll be able to see them. Okay, and immediately you can see that we now have a resource bar and the number as well in our HUD. So our HUD is complete, I guess. So let's place a block. Okay, and immediately you can see that we're using up resource. So as I run around and place blocks, so pointlessly just jumping up into the air, placing blocks for no good reason. And as you can see, we're using up resource. And our resource recharges over time. And I can use the fire block, the block eraser weapon. And as you can see, it consumes very little resource anyway. So you don't really notice it too much. It just sort of stops your resource from recharging, basically. Well, appear to stop recharging anyway. It uses very little resource. So most of the resource gets taken up by actually placing blocks. And as you can see, our blaster is constantly shooting. Whenever I'm destroying a block with the block eraser weapon, our blaster fires as well, and that's pretty annoying. It shouldn't be that way, which is what the next video is going to be about, which is the ability to select weapons. So we can just press like the 3 key or whatever key we choose, and we can cycle through our weapons. So we start with, for example, the default weapon is the blaster, and then we can cycle through, for example, to the rocket or the particle cannon, and then the block eraser, and in that way control what the player is firing when they press left click, so we don't have everything trying to fire all at once, looking very confusing. Okay, so that was it. So this video was nice and simple. We did something nice and simple, which was to implement player resource, and for you now this must become very easy now to do, and it is really very, very simple. So in the next video we'll do something more interesting, where we'll have our weapon selection and we'll set up, it's sort of like a really basic studio inside Unity. It's just another scene where we're going to drag actual game objects inside to that scene, and then we're going to take screenshots of those game objects, and then we're going to turn them into icons in GIMP. So that's really simple too, but it's interesting. It's something a little different. So I'll see you in the next video, and thanks for watching.